The story begins in the early 1970s, when American automakers faced a new and terrifying threat. Japanese manufacturers were flooding the United States market with small, fuel-efficient cars that American consumers loved. Ford Motor Company, one of Detroit's big three automakers, needed an answer, and they needed it fast. Lee Iacocca, Ford's ambitious vice president at the time, had a vision. He wanted to create a car that would beat the Japanese at their own game. His mission was crystal clear. Build a subcompact car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000. It was called the 2000-2000 rule, and it became the driving force behind what would become one of the most infamous vehicles in automotive history, the Ford Pinto. But there was a problem with Iacocca's vision. To meet his aggressive timeline and budget, Ford would have to cut corners. The Pinto was what industry insiders called a rush project. In the standard automotive development process, engineering studies come first, followed by styling. With the Pinto, this process was reversed. Styling came first, and engineering had to follow, dictating design choices in ways that were highly unusual for the industry. As the Pinto moved through development, Ford engineers conducted routine crash tests. What they discovered would haunt the company for decades. During rear-end collision tests at speeds of just 20 miles per hour or higher, something catastrophic happened. The fuel tank ruptured, spilling gasoline that could easily ignite, turning the small car into a rolling fireball. The problem was shockingly simple. The gas tank sat only 5 inches forward of the rear sheet metal and just 3 inches behind the rear axle housing. When another vehicle struck the Pinto from behind, the rear axle would deform and puncture the fuel tank. Sharp, protruding bolts tore through the thin metal like knives through paper. In crash tests at just 20 miles per hour, the rear end crushed more than 8 inches. Ford's own engineers reached a damning conclusion. The rear end structure was not satisfactory. The fuel tank deformed, leaked, and the filler pipe suffered damage. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The engineers identified several simple fixes that could prevent these deadly fires. These modifications were incredibly inexpensive, costing somewhere between $4 and $8 per vehicle, with some estimates putting it at $11 per car. What happened next would become one of the most controversial decisions in corporate history. Instead of implementing the safety fixes, Ford executives made a different choice. They performed what's known as a cost-benefit analysis. This wasn't just any calculation. It was a cold, mathematical equation that placed a dollar value on human life. The numbers were chilling. Ford estimated that fixing the fuel tank would cost $11 per vehicle. When multiplied across all the cars and light trucks that would need the modification, the total came to $137 million. On the other side of the ledger, Ford calculated the benefits of making the fix. They estimated there would be 2,100 burned vehicles, 180 serious burn injuries, and 180 burn deaths. Ford then assigned monetary values to human suffering: $200,000 for each death, $67,000 for each major burn injury, and $700 for each vehicle repair. The total benefit? Just $49.5 million. The conclusion was inevitable from Ford's perspective. Spending $137 million to save $49.5 million in liability costs made no financial sense. A confidential company memo issued in late 1971 directed that no additional safety features be adopted for the 1973 and later model years until required by law. Ford knew the Pinto's fuel system was defective. They knew people would die. But they made a calculated decision that paying out lawsuit settlements would be cheaper than fixing the problem. The Pinto launched to the public in 1971. For the first few years, Ford sold the small cars by the thousands. Americans loved the affordable, zippy little vehicle. But behind the scenes, a pattern was emerging. In April of 1974, the Center for Auto Safety petitioned the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to recall Ford Pintos. Their petition was based on reports from attorneys documenting 3 deaths and 4 serious injuries in rear-end collision accidents. The fuel tank strap design made the tank susceptible to leakage and fire in low to moderate speed collisions. But the petition went nowhere. It languished in government offices for 3 years. During this time, more people died, more families were destroyed, and Ford continued selling Pintos without making any changes to the deadly fuel system design. May 28, 1972, a date that would become central to one of the most significant product liability cases in American legal history. Lily Gray was driving her 1972 Ford Pinto on a Southern California freeway near San Bernardino. Riding with her was 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw, her young neighbor. Without warning, Gray's Pinto stalled on the freeway. Within moments, another vehicle rear-ended the stalled car. The impact speed was just 28 miles per hour, hardly a high-speed collision. But for the Pinto's occupants, it was catastrophic. The fuel tank ruptured instantly. Gasoline sprayed throughout the car and ignited. The Pinto became an inferno within seconds. Lily Gray suffered severe burns and died several days later from complications. But Richard Grimshaw survived, though he would wish he hadn't. The 13-year-old boy sustained burns to 90% of his body, including his face. His nose was incinerated. An ear was burned away. Several fingers were destroyed. He was permanently, horrifically disfigured. The young teenager would endure years of painful surgeries and treatments, carrying the scars of Ford's cost-benefit analysis for the rest of his life. The family sued Ford Motor Company. The case, known as Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company, went to trial in California. What emerged during the proceedings shocked the nation. The plaintiff's attorneys, working with Mother Jones magazine and the Center for Auto Safety, obtained damning internal Ford documents. These papers proved that Ford's upper management knew the Pinto performed poorly in crash tests before they approved its manufacture. The documents showed that Ford could have corrected the hazardous design defects at minimal cost, but decided to defer corrections by engaging in their infamous cost-benefit analysis, balancing human lives and limbs against corporate profits. The trial revealed that Ford owned a patent on a better designed gas tank at the time, but chose not to use it due to cost and styling considerations. Engineers testified that the standard of care in the automotive industry after a failed safety test was to redesign and retest. Ford produced and sold the Pinto to the public without doing anything to remedy the defects. The jury was horrified. On February 10, 1978, they returned their verdict. Richard Grimshaw was awarded $125 million in punitive damages and $2,841,000 in compensatory damages. The family of Lily Gray received $665,000 in compensatory damages. The total award exceeded $127 million. The jury specifically chose $125 million in punitive damages because Ford had made $124 million in profit on the Pinto since its introduction. They wanted to send a message. Corporate profits built on human suffering would not be tolerated. The trial judge later reduced the punitive damages to $3.5 million, calling this amount fair and reasonable. But the message had been sent. The Grimshaw case became the largest punitive damage award in California history up to that point. In September of 1977, Mother Jones magazine published an explosive article titled "Pinto Madness" by investigative journalist Mark Dowie. Using documents from the Center for Auto Safety's files, Dowie exposed the full extent of Ford's knowledge and deliberate inaction. The article detailed the internal Ford documents proving the company knew about the fuel tank weakness before placing the vehicle on the market. It revealed the cost-benefit study suggesting it would be cheaper for Ford to pay liability for burn deaths and injuries rather than modify the fuel tank. The exposé showed that Ford owned a patent on a superior gas tank design, but that cost and styling considerations ruled out any changes. The combination of the Grimshaw verdict and the Mother Jones article created a media firestorm. Public outrage forced government agencies into action. The Center for Auto Safety resubmitted its petition for a defects investigation, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration opened case recall C-7-38. Government investigators conducted their own crash tests on 1971 through 1976 Pinto sedans, hatchbacks, and station wagon models. The results were damning. The test showed significant fuel tank ruptures and leakage across all model years tested. In one particularly horrifying test of a 1976 Pinto, after an impact of just 30.31 miles per hour, the entire contents of the fuel tank leaked out in less than 1 minute. Imagine being trapped in a car after a moderate collision, dazed and confused, while 20 gallons of gasoline pool around you, waiting for a single spark to ignite. The testing revealed another deadly design flaw. After rear-end impacts, the Pinto's doors frequently jammed shut, trapping occupants inside as the vehicle burned. Victims who survived the initial crash found themselves imprisoned in a steel cage that was rapidly filling with flames. On June 9, 1978, under enormous public pressure and facing overwhelming evidence, Ford Motor Company finally agreed to recall 1.5 million Ford Pintos and 30,000 Mercury Bobcats. The recall covered sedan and hatchback models from 1971 through 1976. The modifications Ford would finally implement included a longer fuel filler neck with a better clamp to keep it securely in the fuel tank, an improved gas cap in some models, and placement of plastic shields to protect the tank from the differential bolts and the right rear shock absorber. These were simple, inexpensive fixes that could have been implemented years earlier. Recall notices were mailed in September of 1978, and parts were supposed to be available at all dealers by September 15th. But the recall came too late for many families. Between June 9th, when the recall was announced, and the date when parts actually became available to repair the estimated 2.2 million vehicles, 6 more people died in Pinto fires following rear-end impacts. The deaths didn't stop with the recall announcement, and in one case, the consequences for Ford extended beyond civil liability into criminal prosecution. In Elkhart, Indiana, 3 young women died when their Pinto was rear-ended and burst into flames. An Indiana grand jury took an unprecedented step. They returned criminal indictments against Ford Motor Company for 3 counts of reckless homicide. For the first time in American history, a major corporation faced criminal charges for a defective product that killed. The trial began amid intense media scrutiny. If convicted, it would set a precedent that corporations could face criminal penalties, not just civil lawsuits, for knowingly selling dangerous products. However, on March 13, 1980, the jury found Ford not guilty. There were numerous factors that contributed to the verdict, including evidence that the other vehicle was speeding, the driver possessed alcohol and illegal drugs, and the exclusion of evidence from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration investigation, including the damning crash tests. The local prosecutor also had minimal resources compared to Ford's legal team. Despite the acquittal, the case established that criminal prosecution of corporations for defective products remained a possibility in future cases. Official statistics credited 27 deaths to the Pinto's design defects. However, many experts believe the true number is far higher. Some estimates suggest hundreds of people may have died in Pinto fires over the vehicle's production run from 1971 to 1980. Beyond the deaths, countless individuals suffered severe burn injuries similar to Richard Grimshaw's. These survivors lived with permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and psychological trauma. Many required dozens of reconstructive surgeries over years or decades. Their quality of life was destroyed because Ford executives decided that $11 per car was too expensive. The Pinto case revealed something deeply disturbing about corporate decision-making. When companies perform cost-benefit analyses that assign monetary values to human lives, they create a framework where preventable deaths become acceptable business expenses. Ford's calculations treated burn victims not as human beings, but as line items in a financial spreadsheet. The Ford Pinto scandal fundamentally transformed automotive safety regulations and corporate liability law in America. Before Pinto, fuel system integrity standards only required passenger cars to withstand a 30-mile-per-hour fixed front barrier crash. There were no requirements for side or rear impacts, allowing Ford to claim the Pinto met all applicable safety standards. The Pinto crisis forced regulators to establish much stricter standards. Beginning with the 1977 model year, passenger cars had to meet a 30-mile-per-hour rear-moving barrier test and a 20-mile-per-hour side-moving barrier test. Light trucks and vans received similar requirements for the 1978 model year. The case also revolutionized product liability law. The massive punitive damages awarded in Grimshaw versus Ford established that juries could and would punish corporations for knowingly selling defective products. It sent a clear message. The cost of safety improvements could no longer be weighed against the cost of lawsuit settlements. Today, automotive safety testing is far more comprehensive, and fuel system integrity standards are much more stringent. Modern cars must pass multiple crash tests at various speeds and angles before they can be sold to the public. While cost-benefit analyses remain part of engineering decisions, the Pinto case made it radioactive for companies to explicitly calculate whether deaths are cheaper than safety improvements. The Ford Pinto scandal raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond one company or one product. How many other corporations have made similar calculations but were never exposed? How do we balance the economics of manufacturing with the moral imperative to protect consumers? At what point does cost-cutting become criminal negligence? The Pinto case reminds us that behind every corporate decision are real human beings. 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw wasn't a statistic worth $67,000. He was a child whose life was destroyed because executives prioritized short-term profits over basic safety. Lily Gray wasn't a liability cost of $200,000. She was a person who died a preventable, agonizing death. The engineers who identified the Pinto's defects and recommended fixes were ignored. The executives who saw the crash test results and ordered production anyway faced minimal personal consequences. The cost-benefit analysis that valued human life at $200,000 became business school case studies in what not to do. The Ford Pinto remains one of the most infamous vehicles ever produced, a cautionary tale about corporate greed and regulatory failure. Between 1971 and 1980, Ford sold millions of Pintos, earning substantial profits. But the company paid a heavy price in damaged reputation, legal fees, settlement costs, and lost consumer trust. The scandal contributed to the declining competitiveness of American automakers during the 1970s and 80s, as consumers increasingly turned to Japanese and European brands perceived as safer and better engineered. Ford's reputation suffered damage that took decades to repair. Most importantly, the Pinto case established that corporations have an obligation beyond maximizing shareholder value. They have a responsibility to protect the safety of their customers, even when safety costs more than lawsuits. The $11 per car that Ford refused to spend in 1971 cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in the following years, not counting the incalculable cost of destroyed lives and shattered families. Today, every automotive safety regulation, every fuel system integrity test, and every corporate ethics policy carries echoes of the Ford Pinto scandal. It's a reminder that the true cost of cutting corners is measured not just in dollars, but in human lives. The question we must continue asking is simple. What is a human life worth? Ford Motor Company answered that question in 1971, and the consequences of that answer reverberate through the automotive industry to this day.